massive thanks to everyone at NENA for actually inviting me to the conference and letting me present my ideas today. I also like to say a big thanks to my friends, Dr. Maria Shea and Barry Dish, who themselves are doing a talk at the same time as this one for NENA at the Making Sense of Money. So that might be worth watching the recording for that as well. My presentation today, I've called it National Banking to Save Australia. And so I've divided the presentation into three main segments. So the first is an understanding of what our economic situation really is at the moment, as in what are the central banks doing, what's happening in the markets, and really just taking a broad reality check of just how uncharted and crazy things are happening at the moment. The second part is a history on Australia's national banking systems. And so this is basically Australia has had national banking systems in the past, and I'll get into that as well. And then the third is I'll be presenting my proposals for what I believe is how we can save Australia, or actually generate a significant boost to our standard of living and actually rescue us from this economic destitution we're facing. So a massive thanks to everyone who's watching. A little bit about myself. My name is Samuel Hansen. I'm an independent filmmaker from Sydney. I've just released my first documentary, the Battle for the Bank, Australia's Struggle for Monetary Sovereignty. So this is, it's the history of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And in the film, I basically outlined how the bank was established, how successful it was. And then unfortunately, it actually got hijacked and got taken over by the powers of finance. And so it's against the mechanisms of private finance that I suggest these proposals at the end of we should actually restore the national bank. So anyway, without further ado, I'll get started into my presentation. So the first part is we need to take a frank look at what's really happening in the global economic and financial markets. You know, we have never been at this point before in human history. The central banks are in completely uncharted territory. Interest rates have never been this cheap ever. In fact, the central banks it's as low as it can get. In some regions, it's even negative. And to understand the logic behind negative interest rates is just absolute insanity. That's just, if you're storing money in the bank and you're receiving less back, it's just absolute nuts. Only a central banker would think that's intelligent. But it's been 12 years since the last financial crisis. 2008 was the last financial crisis. And the way we solved that was a massive bailout of the banks. Well, that didn't solve the underlying structural issues, which was a debt-based fiat currency system, which constantly requires more and more lending to keep the system going. So it's been 12 years since then. And now we're absolutely just in no man's land in the uncharted waters. Because in March, we actually had the flash crash in the markets in March. And since then, and under the justification of the corona pandemic, the central banks have gone on an absolutely unbelievable fiscal expansionary policy. So governments around the world have been granted unbelievable budgets and massive spending sprees, all supplied by newly created central bank credit. And so the situation is happening is that we're heading into this expansionary system where the central banks are printing more and more currency, but underneath the physical economy isn't expanding to produce the goods into that system. Rather, most of the money is actually going into the financial assets and keeping the financial system afloat. And that's one of the symptoms of a parasitical, debt-based fiat currency system. So taking a look at the Australian economy itself, Australia for the last couple of decades was a resource economy. We were exporting we were a minerals-based economy. Our currency was unofficially tied to the value of our minerals exports. And most of a large segment of our economy was based upon minerals exports to countries like China and Asia and all over the world. But as the mining boom ran down over the past decade and a bit more, we've transitioned into a housing bubble or into a real estate economy. So real estate, banking, and insurance have really been the three drivers of Australian growth, and it's not sustainable. What we've been seeing is this unbelievable expansion of debt-based currencies, and as Australia has one of the highest private debt to GDP ratios in the world. And it's absolute insanity that people continue to get into the housing market and getting more and more debts But I could go on a tangent there for hours, but my point is that Australia now has a massive unsustainable housing bubble, which I believe is about to pop. And so what does this mean? You know, the reality check is I do believe we're heading towards another global financial crisis, another absolute massive meltdown of the markets, an absolute Armageddon of 2008 times 50, absolutely large. And one of the reasons of that is because we've had an exponentially growing currency system. None of the structural problems were solved. So it's all the problems that have occurred have only gotten larger. And one of the biggest things we have is the derivatives market. And there's approximately $1.5 quadrillion worth of derivatives contracts between the banks. And so what that means is that if one bank collapses, the counterparty risk between all these banks means we're just going to have a contagion effect where the entire banking system just absolutely collapses. And so, you know, the central banks themselves have been in absolute panic ever since the flash crash, or they've been panicking for ages, but the flash crash in March 2020 gave them the justifications to start printing money into the financial markets. And so the Reserve Bank of Australia has announced its first ever quantitative easing. The American banks are just absolutely going, the Federal Reserve's doing all sorts of pumping money into the repo market, which is the short-term interbank lending market. Billions of dollars every day of newly created currencies is going straight into these markets. And there's a graph, which is basically the central bank balance sheets is just skyrocketing at an exponential rate. And so that's the situation we're dealing with here at the moment. And I truly believe it's going to end in either a crash. My prediction is the whole thing is on an absolute powder keg. And so unfortunately, the central banks know that. You know, financial crises have been up and down for years. There's always been the banking system have always profited off of a financial crisis. You know, more millionaires and billionaires were made during the Great Depression and the 2008 GFC than any other time in history. And what I say in my film is that they're actually going to use this new financial crash to establish their globalized system of currency. So basically merge the world's central banks together and set up a one world currency, a globalized financial system, the centralization of monetary policy up in institutions such as the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. And so if you look at a lot of the things that are happening lately with the corona pandemic and things like that, people talking about the Great Reset. Well, this is unfortunately, I think, one of the major parts of the Great Reset is establishing this global central banking system and things like the cashless economy and other things. So that's probably the first part of my presentation, just a frank reality check of this is where we are in the markets and this is how crazy it is. So my second part is basically, it's my film's summarized in about 5 minutes. So Australia has had a history of national banking. So today in Australia, Australia's central bank is the Reserve Bank of Australia. But what a lot of people don't understand is that the Reserve Bank of Australia actually used to be the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And the Commonwealth Bank of Australia that we have today is absolutely nothing like the original Commonwealth Bank of Australia we had under Sir Denison Miller. So what my film was about was understanding the Australian history of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia and basically Australia's monetary policy, because it always was a struggle for monetary sovereignty. And as I called it the battle for the bank, because it was really those trying to, it was a struggle between, you know, a sovereign independent nation versus subservience to the international banking system. So, yeah, well, the bank actually started in the 1911 when Sir Denison Miller, under the first ever Labor government, Prime Minister Fisher actually passed the Commonwealth Bank Act. And prior to that, there was a massive financial crisis in 1890, where basically out of all the banks that called themselves banking institutions, only 10 of them didn't collapse. It was an absolute financial genocide in the 1890s. And that's where this drive for that, we have to have a state bank. We have to have the government must be involved in the banking system. We can't allow the monopolies on the creation of credit to be controlled by the private banks, because they obviously abuse it for their own usurious gains. And so when King O'Malley and Sir Denison Miller are able to establish the bank, Sir Denison Miller does the absolutely amazing feat of establishing the bank from scratch and building it into the prize institution of the Commonwealth. And what we see is that the bank was absolutely able to save Australia during the First World War. It financed all the agricultural production. It basically, it organized the war loans, but that's another story. And then after the war, it set about on a path of national development. And so the credit from the Commonwealth Bank of Australia was used to directly increase the physical production of the economy, whereas the private banks themselves would never have touched any of these loans. So unfortunately, I call it the battle of the bank, because if I'll put the link to the movie in the chat, but you can see that the bank actually gets hijacked by the powers of finance in 1925. But unfortunately, when John Curtin and Ben Chifley come to power in the late 1930s, they're able to rescue the bank again. And then we see the power once again of a strong national banking system. You know, John Curtin and Ben Chifley, they established an institution called the Industrial Finance Department, which was absolutely able to develop the industry which Australia used to fight the war effort. And then if you look at institutions like Holden and the Australian car manufacturing industry, they were all built off the initial funding provided by institutions such as the Industrial Finance Department. And so we have had a long history of national banking and the powers of national credit in Australia. But unfortunately, the bank gets hijacked again with Menzies, and then Menzies passes the Reserve Bank Act, and the Reserve Bank the Commonwealth Bank becomes the Reserve Bank Act, the Reserve Bank of Australia, and we unfortunately Australia becomes, you know, just another vassal within the global monetary system. You know, we can talk about the Bretton Woods system as well, how we signed up to the IMF and the World Bank, but that's another detour. so I'll get to my third point. So the reason I titled my presentation as National Banking to Save Australia is because I truly believe that these institutions, that the mechanisms of government are powerful institutions for not only guarding the liberties of the Australian people, but also for providing the fundamental economic activity from which the prosperity of the Australian people can derive. So my first and probably my number one proposal is that we need to re-establish the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, re-establish a national-owned government bank with the ability to compete with the private banks and to issue credit, and also handle the financial transactions of the government. And what the whole purpose of this is, once the government or the people have the ability over the functions over credit again, then we can, Sir Dennis Miller himself said, whatever the Australian people can conceive in their minds and will loyally support, that can be done. You know, that's my part number two. You utilize the public credit to finance the grand infrastructure projects to lift Australia out of economic depression. So things like a national steel building industry, high-speed rail networks across Australia, all sorts of alternate energies and water desalination plants. Really, the limitations on the Australian capacities for growth aren't going to be limited by the financial capacities or the financial constraints imposed by private bankers. By regaining control over the note issue and the capacity to issue credit, that's where we can regain our national sovereignty and absolutely save Australia from the usurious grips of the international bankers. My third point is it's come up quite a bit, and I guess it's very, very popular at the NENA conference, is that the National Bank could be the perfect mechanism for issuing national dividend payments to Australian citizens. And these won't be debt-based currency payments, rather they would be national credit-based dividend payments. So sort of like a universal basic income, but the one thing that has to be guaranteed is that there must not be any restrictions at all. There can't be any requirements or systems for government control. Rather, it is a representation of a citizen's equity in the institution that is the National Bank of Australia, which would be the government control over the issuance of currency. And so national dividend payments are really a bright prospect for the future, I believe. And my fourth point is that the primary function of the national bank is that it allows us to resist this globalist agenda to set up a one world currency. It's all about reclaiming control over the national sovereignty of Australia's monetary system and in turn the economic system, and enables us to break away from the globalist agenda to basically hijack the nation. And so I'm completely opposed to a one world currency and a cashless society. So to me, I believe a national bank and control over monetary policy must be restored back into the hands of the people, back into the hands of government. And then once that right has been restored, and the monopoly over the creation of credit is no longer the exclusive privilege of the private bankers, then I truly believe that Australia can lift itself out of any economic depression. So that's my presentation. Thank you everyone so much. If you're interested in my, I'll stick a link to my DVD in the chat as well. So thank you everyone. Thank you, Monique.